Welcome to another Catholic Family News special report. I am Brian McCall, the editor-in-chief of Catholic Family News, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown, who is a professor at the University of Chicago with appointments in both the Divinity School and the History Department. Her PhD is from Columbia University, and she's published extensively, but two of her books are related to medieval devotion and prayer. So this is, I think, the most recent of them, Mary and the Art of Prayer, the Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought. And then her other book, which I guess which was published previously, is From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 800 to 1200. But today we're not going to speak specifically about her scholarship, but we're going to talk about a topic that we've discussed in the newspaper and on other parts of Catholic Family News, the difficulties with higher education and what I say is the liberal infiltration of higher education. So welcome to the special report program, Dr. Brown, and we're happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So maybe could you tell us just a little bit, I give it just a very brief bio, but a little bit about yourself and your background. So were you raised as a Catholic? Did you grow up in or did you come to the church later in life?
So I came to the church only 4 years ago. I was raised Presbyterian.
Okay.
And I spent most of the time that I was in graduate school as I suppose Anglican Episcopalian, right? Some of the time that I was in graduate school, I was in England and Wales. And I was also, I mentioned I was at Columbia. I started going to St. John the Divine there, the Episcopal Cathedral.
Yes. Okay.
And my husband is English, and we were going to an Episcopal church here. I served, so quite actively in that congregation for 14 years, right? That made altar bread, and I was on the liturgy committee and so forth. But in all of this time, I'd been doing my scholarship on the medieval devotion. And when I finished the second big book, The Mary and the Art of Prayer, I was invited down to St. Louis University. Some of my friends were there, colleagues, to give a talk on the book. And they've been, Catholics are great, right? You're all really very encouraging, right? And they're all sitting around with their rosaries going, why aren't you Catholic? I had just at that point become friends with Milo Yiannopoulos, who you may have been following some of his journey as well.
Yes.
And we were sort of bantering together, and I'm like, well, I'll be Catholic if you get a dog. He said, well, I'm getting a dog, but she still hasn't. I have a dog. Which one of the reasons for scheduling when we did for this is I just got a new puppy. My husband and I just got a new puppy. And so we had to pace it so that, the dog was able to cope with me being online again. Yes. But the thing is, I realized, it's been a gentle journey, a long journey through my scholarship, through my, quest for, as I put it, sort of most grandiosely, my quest for wisdom. And realizing when I finished Mary and the Art of Prayer, I was sort of like there, right?
Yes.
Because Mary and the Art of Prayer it's very much showing the liturgy of the devotion to Our Lady in the Hours of the Virgin, the medieval Hours of the Virgin. And those are so deeply grounded both in the lessons like from Ecclesiasticus, but also from the Wisdom of Solomon, but also in representing Mary as she's portrayed as the Mother of God through the Psalms, right? And so I figured I was inundated with signs that it was time.
Yes.
And I wrote to our local parish here and said, I'd like to come to RCIA, please. I don't know whether I was a benefit or a terror, because I kept, I'd come into scripture and be going, well, when I was arguing about this in my book, and they're like, oh, who is she? And why is she talking about Mary all the time?
Well, it's interesting because many times for people who have been raised in a Protestant denomination, the Blessed Mother is often a stumbling block to coming to the church. But it's sort of interesting that your academic career kind of helped with that in a certain sense by introducing you to it. So speaking
Well,
about,
that's why I say, so in Mary in the Art of Prayer, I say in the acknowledgments that it was interesting to me that Mary chose me as a Presbyterian to write this book, right? I do have that sense of, I kept trying to like write about something else, and Our Lady had other purposes. But that growing up Presbyterian, I grew up in a very scripturally rich conversation. And so my studies in undergraduate, I was in history and religious studies, and a lot of it was in New Testament. And I was drawn to, and this is in the first book, From Judgment to Passion, drawn to understanding Mary through the scriptures that were used in her liturgies in the Middle Ages and in commentaries on those scriptures. So as far as I'm concerned, it was an appropriate journey for me, because I needed to understand the scriptural basis for the devotion to Our Lady, which is a very Protestant sort of response. But on the other hand, now I can say the Protestants, kind of missed the point when in the 16th century they were saying there's nothing in scripture about Mary. The scripture is full of Mary.
Yes. Yes. No, very true. Very true. Well, speaking about academia, sort of our main topic for this this conversation, you have been very outspoken, and you have a really interesting blog and place where you speak out about Christianity, about particularly the role of Christianity in education. And it's ironic that the church is really the reason for universities. The church founded and started the university system. But what do you think has happened? It's a long road from there, from the 12th century, let's say, to here. But how is it that religion has become kind of the most prohibited thing in an academic setting?
It is a very long road, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's see, I've mentioned Milo, and there's sort of element that comes into this, that back 4 years ago when things blew up, almost really blew up around him at Berkeley, the editor of the University of Chicago Divinity School newsletter asked me to reflect on his tour, right? Because I've been writing on the blog about it, and I was talking about, the spiritual and religious significance of what I heard him saying, particularly, for example, that the last talk he gave before that Berkeley Not talk was on against abortion, right? That he's been very, very outspoken against abortion in any way, right? That there's no excuses for it. And he'd given that talk, and then the Berkeley talk didn't happen. And the editor of Sightings asked me to write a little piece on what I thought the religious significance of his tour was for American academia, on college campuses. And one of the things I said specifically in that piece was, the universities were founded as places where people argued theology. And that was curious to me that, what I saw in the sort of explosiveness around Milo was an unwillingness to actually address the theological questions that he was presenting. Right. My own colleagues in the divinity school got angry at me for saying that. And specifically for saying things like the American universities, were originally founded as theological schools. I mean, things like Harvard and Yale, they're seminaries.
They were seminaries, yes.
They were seminaries, and that was one of the points that Milo had made in one of his lectures, when he said that the Catholic Church is right about everything, right? And it's like, our education system was founded, to train preachers. Like, I say I grew up Presbyterian, and Princeton, when it was the College of New Jersey, was, the training ground for the Presbyterian ministers. So to have a history of our country that doesn't include the fact that the reason we care so much about education is that we were Christian.
Yes.
And have my own colleagues in academia, they wrote a bunch of answers, and I did a response to that on the blog back in 4 years ago, 7 with 1 blow, because there were 7 responses, and I'm going, okay, which one of these is going to be the only one who did any, I thought had a really strong argument, was one of the graduate students, but the others were kind of off in one direction and off in another. One of my own colleagues in history said, basically my ideas were too odious to even address. And I think in fact what she meant was claiming that there should be some kind of practice in theological debate within academia was too hateful even to consider. And at that point I said, well, if we don't practice this in controlled environment in the classroom where we're actually learning to read text and learning to see through arguments from other perspectives and such, it's just going to spill out into the streets. And I certainly would say I think that's what's happened, particularly in the last year, when we're kind of in a grip of a religious frenzy, right, in the United States. And I'm sort of idealistic in a lot of ways, but we're failing in our religious education more than anything else, right? We're failing in a context in which people have the ability to really appreciate the degree to which our it's not just one phrase I tend to talk about is like mythology, but I mean that in like this strong sense of the stories that give meaning to our lives, right? And if we don't have practice understanding how deeply ingrained those are for us, we do end up just throwing stuff at each other.
So use it in the sense Tolkien did mythology. Is that?
Yes.
Yes.
And
okay.
and I do actually have a video series on Tolkien. So
if you want
the deep version of all of this, it's in my Tolkien lecture.
Yes. Oh. So picking up on that, it's interesting because the 19th century and even the 18th century popes, when they warned the world about liberalism, I think we're saying, I think they predicted where it's going. Whereas liberalism had that allure in the beginning of, we just want to allow everything. We just want to allow different views. We want to allow openness. But particularly in academia, hasn't it become full circle where it's, as you said, it's your colleagues, who claim probably they're in favor of academic freedoms, want you silenced because your views are odious or whatever words they use. So could talk a little about this seeming contradiction in liberalism, particularly in academia, that claims to promote freedom, yet at the same time wants to silence people.
Well, so because when people blow up at me, I tend to go do some more research and try to figure out why they were angry.
Yes.
I realized that I'm arguing as a medievalist, and there's no question that the University of Paris or the University of Oxford or Cambridge were, the theology faculty was one of the major professional faculties from the begining, right? It's like in Paris, if you wanted to do high theory, you were arguing theology. You mentioned, yes, that academia has gone through many iterations since then, surviving it all amazingly, right? So I'm not sure the universities are all just going to crumble. However, we do have to remember what Henry VIII managed to do to the monasteries, right? So the state will always have an interest in the property and the income and things like that. So
yes,
we should be mindful of that. But that transformations happened in the Reformation, in the English system. So Catholics had a hard time teaching in the universities until in fact the 19th century in England, right? That they weren't allowed to hold positions. You have developments obviously in the 18th century with the Enlightenment and the philosophical. It's interesting. It's like freedom of speech comes out of that atheism, right? That idea that the atheists are wanting us to be able to debate, which they're perfectly comfortable with blasphemy.
Yes.
All along, Voltaire is famously very comfortable with blasphemy. So that one thing you could just say is, well, the Christians were a little naive. If you let the free thinkers, as the 19th century atheists called themselves, carry the day, then eventually they're just going to be, what I do think is worth thinking about is why the free thinkers and the blasphemers, just to be blunt, become the majority in American higher education. Lots of things happened in the 19th century that are worth sort of playing out, and some of it is multiple strands of the history of higher education. Right? We have the English tradition, which becomes Anglican and philosophical in one fashion, the continental tradition, which is where places like the University of Chicago get their research culture from the German seminar system, and then France, which is, of course, since the revolution, declared it, itself dedicated to the laicite, right? The lay, and American higher education is like buffeted about by movements that come from all of those traditions, from the English, the French, and the German, probably others too. But the German one I appreciate somewhat better now, was very deeply bound up, of course, with the state. And so, I think one of the things that my academic colleagues in the research sciences were responding to, and they're saying, she doesn't know the history of education. We're probably thinking more along some of those philosophical lines. So I was just thinking back to the medieval tradition and, well, it's theology, but they're right that, we need to appreciate, all of the other consequences that have come with that. What I said in the Sightings article, though, was something I got from Stephen Prothero, which I think is worth throwing on the table here, is that one of the strong reasons that American higher education ended up secularizing was because the universities themselves in the 19th century got sort of weary of the denominational fights that they were having among themselves, or whatever the Catholics were doing, the Protestants got tired of arguing with each other. And so they kind of made a gentleman's agreement to stop teaching theology, with the expectation that would all carry on in the schools, in the Sunday schools. And so it's like American higher education secularized itself, and then Christianity didn't carry on with the Sunday school education. And now we end up with nobody getting any of it.
Yes. Well, it's interesting.
I think that's the shortest version I can give of that story. It's a lot of different strands, right? And so when we're looking at who to point the finger at, history has got a lot of actors.
Yes. Well, it's interesting, picking up on something you said. I've seen in one of your other talks, when you talk about the Inquisition, for example, and bring up some of the facts about it, that it's often that moderns or atheists will blame the church for something that actually wasn't the church. So, for example, the Inquisition's brought up horrible tortures, and and interesting, if you compare to the 20th century, the people that were killed by the state unjustifiably as innocents and were tortured. I mean, the Inquisition, I'd take my chances with the Inquisition any day compared to what we've done. But interestingly, what and I think the witch trials is another one you bring up, that the church is accused of that when it was really Protestant denominations that were famous for that. So it's interesting, I think, with the academy, a lot of times what liberals or atheists will say, oh, the church was always the one, stopping academic freedom, stopping debate, and was controlling, where ironically, that I think, in my opinion, is not really the case. I mean, if you look, that Thomas Aquinas and C.J. of Brabant could have a huge debate in the University of Paris, and have those aired. And obviously propositions were condemned, but there, in many ways, was much more freedom in medieval academic universities, at least in my opinion, than compared to sort of some forms of modern academia today. What's your thoughts on that? Would you agree or not?
So with the Inquisition, I think you saw the talk that I gave in Canada, in London, Ontario, right? And
yes,
interestingly, the professor I'm relying on there, Tom Madden, is the one who invited me to St. Louis University to give that talk.
Yes.
So it's a small world.
Yeah.
And he was reviewing some books that came out on the Inquisition some years ago, and saying, if you look at the actual numbers, because the Inquisition kept very good records. The whole point was they're questioning people, and it's you get to like talk to somebody, that the people in the day would, as you said, they prefer to be brought before the inquisitorial courts than before a secular court. Compare with the Reformation courts in Tudor England, right? The state is perfectly capable of executing lots and lots of people, way more than the Inquisition ever brought. to the stake. The role of the church, so thinking about the church, and you're saying in the 13th century, and you're talking about those debates over things like the
unity of knowledge, the Aristotelian,
right?
Yes.
They're reading Aristotle, and there's that famous list of condemnations in 1277 that says, you're not going to be allowed to talk about this stuff anymore, or you cannot hold these positions. That's the same century, though, that the Inquisition is really getting off the ground, and the whole point of the universities is training men like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, very much the Dominicans, to know the theological debates that they're going to be in. So the Dominicans in particular have, major efforts to, learn about not just heresy, but also about, the Hebrew scriptures.
Yes.
Famously, they find out, therefore, about the Talmud, and King Louis has some of them confiscated and burned. Insofar as they can with the Muslim theologies. And so they're actually, that's what I was thinking of, right? They're actually practicing knowing the truth of the theological debates that the people that they're talking to are in. Whereas now, I mean, as far as I can tell, for most, scholarship or discussion in comparative religion, we just sort of bracket truth in a way that means you never actually get to argue at the level that the people whose arguments you're studying would make. It's like, it matters whether we get this right. And that's what's sort of interesting to me about theology in the modern academy. It's so fenced off from engagement with actual disagreement that we never, in fact, get any good at testing our own understanding of, for example, the Trinity, right? It hurts Christians as well as, making nonsense of our active engagement with the intellectual tradition, because we can't even talk properly in comparative terms about our own faith.
No, I said it's true. In a certain sense, if it was a reaction against maybe the 19th century heated theological debates, they just wanted to call a truce on that. I mean, we sort of have the opposite problem, because we're so afraid of that. We don't want to talk about anything or pretend there really are no differences theologically. That's interesting. Well,
right. That's what I was pointing to in the Science article, saying we don't practice it at all. And what I find in my own, just in my life, but also in intellectual context, when people don't know how to make an argument, they get scared, and then they get angry because they feel threatened and trapped. Right. And so if you've practiced, like my blog is Fencing Barrett Prayer, right? If you've trained in being attacked by a foil and a fencing bout or something, what kinds of responses to make. If you have no training in that whatsoever, all you do is get frightened and angry. Yeah.
Yes, emotional. Yes.
You get very emotional, and the more you practice with it, it's like, okay, so I actually can make an argument now about, well, why do Christians talk about the Trinity? Well, Jesus talks about God the Father in this new way, and nobody had ever heard that, that phrasing before. And then, when he dies and his followers, have this understanding that he had risen again and is actually the Lord, and what does it mean to call him the Lord, and who is he as Christ, that it comes out of that conversation is supposed, like, well, you believe the Trinity or you don't, and if you don't, you're damned, and that makes no sense. It's like, none of this is going to convince anybody, because we as Christians don't have the practice speaking across the misunderstanding or across the rhetoric, right?
Yes. Well, maybe if we can switch a little bit to maybe the student perspective. So what have you observed in your teaching career in terms of, do you think students come to universities already sort of infected with secularism, atheism, or, as many allege, do you think they really are being transformed by in general by universities and sort of having their worldviews or their faith changed?
Well, I'm old enough to know that it's been going on a lot longer than all my students were alive, right? And I'm still young enough to know that I wasn't in the first wave of it, right? This is hardly a new conversation. I mean, it easily goes back to the Enlightenment,
Yes.
if not before then. So it's kind of the water we've been swimming in, right? And you pointed out, I mean, the 19th century has concerns with liberalism and modernism,
Yes.
and the syllabus of errors
Yes.
like lists them all out. So
Yes.
this is not a new situation. It's
But I guess what is new is even in the 19th century that was there, but still, if you went to places like, any colleges, Yale, Harvard, you still studied classic European civilization. You still studied the Greek and Latin classics. I mean, I think that's really changed in the 20th century from then.
I'm going to have to disabuse you.
Okay.
No, well, so, for example, like I mentioned, the changes that come in the 19th century when they sort of give up arguing theology. Some of that happens. I mean, and the flagship schools are really important here because they sort of set the tone, right? When Harvard and Yale gave up their 4-year curriculum in the classics, and it was in the late 19th century, right? That rippled down, right?
Yes.
And that we in the American university systems now do, you sort of design your own majors and you pick the field that you're going to study, and there's a repertoire of courses that you can select from and stuff. Harvard started that.
Yes.
But I think like the 1880s or so, this is in Stephen Protero's book, Religious Literacy, and saying, so that displacement of the classics has been going on for some time. The Greek and Latin hold on as departments now, but the expectation,
barely, yes.
barely, the expectation that there would be a common sort of repertoire of texts that students would come knowing. Interesting, if you think, one of the last places that may have been in fact the case would be something like the McGuffey readers.
Yes.
And those, I read a nice essay, I think it was one of Marilyn Robinson's some decades ago, when she's talking about the way the McGuffey readers were important for the abolition movement, because they were printed with the expectation that, sort of teaching students to read, right? And I was showing one of my classes just this quarter, the one of the readers where they're talking about, proper pronunciation for reading poetry, right? And then they have a selection of texts that you're meant to practice off of, that those readers are kind of like iconic in the sense of, well, yeah, everybody would have, read a poem by Alexander Pope or something and that would have been like in high school or so. I don't think there has been, except for maybe at the University of Chicago, for most of the 20th century, anything like a common curriculum in most schools, right? So the sort of what you're feeling is that drifting away from having a common culture. It's been going on for more than my own lifetime.
Yes.
And the loss of prestige that the humanities has subjected itself to has been, I think, more telling, right? That since the 60s and 70s, and the introduction of all the French critical theorists, and Derrida and company have a lot to answer for. It's like, we'll come in and we can't have a text that we can actually talk. That's caricaturing Derrida a bit, although I did hear him talk. I heard him talk in person when I was in college in Houston at Rice, right? He came and we all sort of sat there and we went, ooh, we knew his name, right? It was like, ooh, and you have this kind of hypnotic effect that he's talking, about something or other. I remember leaving the auditorium going, I felt like I understood what he was saying while he was speaking, but now I can't say what he said. That hit American academia completely in the 60s and 70s, so that we all lost, like in the humanities, any sort of sense of there is a story that we're supposed to be anchoring ourselves in and studying and wrestling with. And that, I think, is the big thing that's happened, so that my students come to my classes, obviously with my reputation following me. So I tend to get the ones who are like, you're going to teach us how to read, aren't you? And I'm like, yeah. So they're still out there because there's still students that grow up loving stories, right?
No, and it's interesting, I think, the way you trace that, the breakdown of theology, then you're right. I agree. The breakdown of the classical curriculum starts in the late 19th century, but in a certain sense I think they're related, because Christianity is transmitted through the culture, right, in a certain sense, and having that lack of reference to the common stories, whether the Greek and Roman classics or the literature, is sort of taking away the vocabulary to transmit Christianity in a certain sense. I don't know if you would agree.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
I would absolutely agree. And that's why it's sort of, I don't know, generationally, but I grew up Presbyterian. I grew up reading the scriptures, right? I have so many Bibles because I kept given them, right? I'm given one at baptism. I'm given another at confirmation.
Right.
It's like, I have, how many Revised Standard Versions do you need, right? I have lots, right? And
you probably didn't get the Vulgate, though.
No, that one I got in college
Right.
for $3. We had, it's like, because I was doing Latin, right? And
Yes.
I wanted to learn Latin. That, I got to college already with a desire to read the scriptures deeply. And I can't decide whether that was strange of me or I was the last gasp growing up, right? And it's like, again, I credit my Presbyterian and my family too, right? I say a lot of what comes into my story, my academic story, as well as my sort of cultural story, is my family on both sides comes from Middle America, right? We come the sort of Midwest boy, Germanic, Scots-Irish. A lot of us vote for Trump, right? Although maybe not directly in my own family right now, but that region of the country, right?
Yes.
The sort of middle across Arkansas, Oklahoma, North Texas, and things like that. And my own family, right, are also therefore, like my grandparents on my mom's side, my mother's parents met at college, one of these Presbyterian colleges in Missouri, right? And lots of very well-educated women in my family. My grandmother's mother, yes, went to college in Arkansas, right? So we're like really literate. He's like embarrassingly literate, but not elite in the sense of like East Coast liberals or West Coast liberals, just, Middle America educated Presbyterian scripture readers. So I just grew up with, and I think I grew up with potentially one of the latter generations of what Protero was describing, is with that expectation that you're going to get all these stories in Sunday school, and we did. But I started teaching here in '94, and it has always been a little tricky being able to assume whether or not my students know the Bible at all, right? And I'm teaching a course this quarter on virtue, or it's called How to Be Good, right? And so I'm just like upfront assigning things from, Confucius, Plato, Aristotle, but the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Rule of St. Benedict. This week we're reading some from the Talmud, which is interesting. It's not a tradition I bred much in. And then Aquinas, we're going to end it with Aquinas. And, the students in class, they're here at Chicago, they're well educated. For some of them, it's really the first time they've ever read the Bible. At all. At all. And so now I realize, okay, well, that's going to be, it's like, just give them the Bible. They have nothing to read it against or in opposition to. It's just novel and sort of astonishing and brilliant to them. That's cool. Right?
Yes.
When was the last time you read Numbers carefully, right? And it's like, no, I had them read Numbers because that's a good sort of place to see how the tabernacle worship was situated, right, in the desert there, right?
Yes.
And it was clear, these were they were well read, but they'd never read the scriptures. And so I think we could say, let's just teach them these stories and learn what it's like to think through those stories again, and then you get to have these fascinating things of you know what Ezekiel saw? It reads like something out of like a real high like stakes fantasy novel.
Yes.
The seraphim, whoa, they're cool, right?
That's like a sci-fi film almost. Yes.
It is. It
yes,
is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, very true. Well, speaking of students, what would you say to parents or students who are finishing high school now? I mean, what do you go to the university, given all the things we're talking about? If you go, how do you navigate it? What's your thoughts for, and this is from somebody who didn't know, was raised Catholic, but didn't know really much about it and was thrown into a secular university, didn't go well, and found the faith later. But what do you think students should do given this current environment?
don't take loans.
Well,
I know. I think
I second that.
the single worst thing that's happening to higher education is the cost.
Yes.
Right. We really need a reform of the pricing. Right. And the student loans have helped the bubble build. With that in mind, so one, what's interesting is, of course, Catholics are having more kids than most people. So yes, they're going to be the students, right? And that's sort of what's funny. It's like, well, you know, if you're going to have people to teach and their younger generation, like, who are they going to be? Well, the Catholics are still going to have bigger families. So own it, right? And rejoice in it. To recognize that, you know, we don't belong in this world. And one of my friends who's prior of the Holy Cross Monastery here, once I think it was on Facebook, and I was saying something about feeling distressed or something like that. And he's like, well, you know, this isn't our home. We were made for, another realm, right? We were made for heaven. And so Christians, you know, it's frustrating, it's terrifying, and I'm quite scared, you know, not infrequently about what we're going to have to face. But on the other hand, we are meant to be training for this. To have to recognize the world and its devices. And I've been thinking about this fantasy literature because I'm actually reading some novels by John C. Wright, who's one of the sort of fellow authors in my orbit with Castelia House, because you didn't mention one of my books that's published at Castelia House. And he's Catholic, and he's written these amazing fantasy novels where, for example, when one of the characters is baptized, the priest who's going to do the baptism is saying, do you realize what this means? It's like, you're just going to be embattled against everyone. And she's like, no, I want this. And then, of course, in the story, it's necessary because she ends up in an elfscape hell problem with, you know, why is this pure virgin here? And she's like, well, she was just baptized, right? And so there's this, you know, this lovely sacramental understanding in the story of, we have the coolest story, right? We are living in not just Tolkien, right? We're living in the reality that we are made for this other realm, and are, the seraphim. I was thinking about that because the seraphim show up in this story when she has this ring that when she turns, she can see different sort of modes of, not reality, but like she can see the mist world and the heavenly world and stuff like that. And when she can see the angels, it's like, whoa. And they're like, yeah, they're always here with us. We just don't always see them. So to understand the way in which we are alive in this magnificent creation that is beyond our ability to describe, it's there in scripture, but we don't read it anymore because, the scripture, that's just about being moral and good, and you just have hateful thoughts because you don't want people to have sex all the time. It's like, wait a minute. No, that's not really
right. Well, it almost sounds like the opposite of the One Ring, where you see you see the evil side. This ring, you see the angels. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think Wright's been reading a lot of Tolkien, so there's some playing off of that. But yes,
interesting.
So I'd say, one, I am unusual in academia, but okay, fine. I do know, it's like the students that come to the University of Chicago, and this is why I don't really have a good cross section of what are students like in universities, because they come to University of Chicago knowing our reputation, which is that we're going to set it up for them so that there's no safe spaces, and we expect to have to argue. And so in this course, the How to Be Good course, I have a full range. I cannot, there's not like one side and the other or something like that. There's of the students it's a small seminar size class, so the 8 students, I can't predict which way they're going to go on different topics, and that is, again, it's what I think we should have always been modeling in the academy, which is different from, I'm not preaching, I'm showing them, how are you going to read the Old Testament to understand what the temple worship was like, what it's like for Daniel having to stand up to, the king in Babylon? What is it like, reading Paul and Acts and Hebrews? Stop worrying about which, label you identify with and see what they're actually saying. And then the world opens up. It becomes, like glorious and magnificent and challenging.
Well, maybe switching back to the professor side or the faculty sides, what do you think people that are in universities now, faculty that are trying to either, integrate or approach teaching and scholarship from not just a Christian perspective, but even just the European civilizational perspective? What can you do to sort of navigate and survive in the academy? Because I think there's sort of one tendency, and people say, and I've talked to people, I don't even want to apply. I'm not going to try that because it's, you'll get persecuted, which has never really been the Catholic answer, to run away. But what do you think about that? About Catholics sort of surviving in, or even, I said, not even just Catholics, but Catholics or anyone who's willing to talk about the European civilizational history?
Well, now I've got myself like, I was teaching about rhetoric today. We were reading Martianus Capella and learning about rhetoric, and I'm going to persuade you to joy.
Yes.
What's funny about it all, and this is, what I saw in Milo and what I tried to write about and saying, is like he was saying, with Chesterton, we should be sharing with people the faith. I think this is from Orthodoxy, right? When Chesterton's talking about the Salvation Army and how they're out there singing hymns, and why don't we should be celebrating this glad and angry faith, and with laughter and war, right? And so the laughter and war and the joy. And I say, well, what's happened with the most academics are kind of miserable. And certainly they've spent a lot of this past year just like scared.
Yes.
And sad and hiding. And I'm, like I said, I do have my moments when this is really hard, but for the most part, I'm like, what I spent this year doing? Learning how to write iambic pentameter, just like Alexander Pope, which is why we were reading Alexander Pope. And I'm saying, we're going to read an essay on criticism, because I had this group that we're working on. This is not on campus. I was on leave. And so I was like retooling, right? And I'm like, I want to learn to write, poetry properly, not well, just like scanning, right? And so we're gonna, we'll read some Alexander Pope, and then, well, let's write our own, right? And so you're modeling yourself on the masters, and then we ended up writing this little poem that is my 5th book, actually. It's Centrism Games. It's a satire modeled on Alexander Pope's Dunciad. And by the end of it, we'd, been arguing about rhyme. We'd had to learn consonants and vowels. We'd had to, really know the difference between trochees and spondees and pyrrhic feet. Wow. And where's the iambic pentameter? For goodness sake, the joy of education used to be in actually learning skills, not tearing down everybody else's art, right?
Yes.
And it's certainly a miserable world in which the only thing you get to do in the study of the human, our arts, is deconstruct it, thank you so much Derrida, into its parts, and then say there's nothing there. I say, this is my sort of rallying cry, after laughter and war, iambic pentameter, go back to actually learning the tools of speaking well and crafting phrases well and making your arguments, and then you apply that to whatever material you're thinking about. And of course, if you're Catholic, it's not confined to English, for example, right? We should be reading Spanish and all of the other languages that Catholics speak. Well, guess what? That's most of the world. Right? People have to learn Chinese, right? So that we can speak to the Chinese Christians. And just push back with joy against the nonsense, which is claiming that Western civilization is somehow closed off from the rest of the world. It never was. I mean, it really, truly never was. It wasn't closed off in the Middle Ages. It wasn't closed off in the early modern period. That the whole premise of, Christianity is we translate the scriptures into all languages to speak to all. That's what Pentecost is. So why aren't we celebrating Pentecost?
Yes.
That's soon. It's essentially today. We'll get to Pentecost.
We're almost there. Yes.
So diversity. I mean, what the diversity that the academy is calling for, I'm like, yeah, sure. Well, just like the apostles, did.
Yes. Yes, they spoke in languages that the whole diversity could understand. I mean, the whole idea was, in the early church was, this is not just the Jewish religion. This is now for all. It's open for all.
Right.
Yes, which you're right. I mean, the church is the most diverse institution in history.
Right. Yes. Exactly. And what's interesting about it is saying, how did we end up losing our confidence? That I think is harder. And I do think we do need to train ourselves better in, I guess, apologetics, but not apologetics in the kind of, I'm online a lot in sort of different contexts and stuff, and to say there's a lot of apologetics going on online, right? There's big debates going on among the men on Telegram about orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy. You'd be surprised. Yes. But they tend to quite quickly turn into people wanting to belong to particular clubs and being able to say, well, I know the difference between, the popes have fallen into heresy, and we don't accept the filioque, and our liturgy is the oldest. And I'm like going, oh my goodness, missing the spirit, I'd say, and why we need to perform the liturgy well, why we care about whether or not the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, or just from the Father. It's like getting what my rubric, getting inside of the argument so as to be able to unveil, unlock them and unveil and open up the mysteries, not so as to decide which gang we belong to.
Yes. Well, ultimately, it comes down to truth is what's important, and that if you really are embracing the faith, it's because it's to lead you to truth. It's not, as you said, to be in a club like I have this, but to find your way to the truth. Which again, going back to earlier, why St. Thomas, there are two paths to the same truth. They both lead to the same truth, faith and reason, and you rely on both because you're trying to get to the single goal. But truth doesn't really matter much in many university or academic debates. I mean, that's almost the bracketed thing, as you say. Well, you can talk about whatever you want to present your paper, but don't say anything's true.
Right, and that is the thing that we're really going to have to fight hard, right? You need to say, even in the sciences, they're starting to get some of these attacks, saying, mathematics doesn't show truth anymore. It's like, okay, the quadrivium is going to be in trouble. The trivium had been in trouble.
That's right.
But that we do, and this I think is, was the concern, even in the 19th century. You mentioned the syllabus of errors. Like at some point, you do have to claim, right?
Yes.
That there is a truth, and we have to push back against the Protestant development in the 19th century, which the sort of Schleiermachian adjustment to the Enlightenment, saying, well, we can't know it, we can feel it. And I was like, no, that is against the medieval understanding that you have both affect and intellect. But we're also going to just have to be willing to, when someone says, well, are you saying my worship of God is wrong? And we're going to have to be able to say with love and, joy, yes, it's idolatry. And I can show you why.
Yes. Yes.
You have fallen into worshiping the world and not worshiping God. And if insofar as you're worshiping the world, it will have these effects. You felt them in your own life. You can see how and then when they get angry at us, just say, well, not I pray for you, because that's a bit aggressive in certain ways, but just not get angry back, right? Which you are going back to the beginning of our conversation. You can't do unless you practice it.
Yes.
You can't do it if you don't know how to answer all of their arguments about, did you know Mary is actually just a goddess from, she's like Isis warmed over. And it's like, well, did you know that, Jesus describes himself through these Psalms, which we can see as the enthronement Psalms, and he's described as the king seated in the throne and anointed by his Father. Exactly what does that mean? And are you at all worried that he's Horus, right? Which is nonsense. But the sort of not being threatened by these comparative religious sort of fudgings that were created over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yes, yes. Well, that when you're talking about that, reminded me of a story. Once that when I was having dinner with Bishop Villay, he told me he was driving in Switzerland with this atheist, total intellectual skeptic. We can never know anything, never know what's true, and whatever we subjectively believe, is true for us. So the bishop, they were driving on this 2-lane high road in Switzerland. He sort of pulled over to the other lane when there was a huge truck coming towards them. And he said, well, I can't know. How do I know that's a truck? I have no way of knowing. Subjectively, I don't think it's there. And his nerves of steel just kept driving. So finally, the atheist grabbed the wheel and swerved back to the other lane. He said, see, you can tell that there is something that's true when you want to. Which I thought, yeah, that summarizes it perfectly.
That's nerves of steel. You need that.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, very true.
Don't let them, and the other side of it is the things that Christians have been hamstrung by most, right? It's like, that's not nice. And you're like, I'm not worried about being nice, right? You're telling me not to be impolite. Right. I'm worried about telling you the truth. Yes. Right. And as you say, it's like, and because if you don't know the truth, you will die.
Yes. Yes, very true.
How dare you? It's like, well.
Well, so getting about towards the end of our time together a little bit, is there anything else we haven't covered on this topic you want to bring up or you want to share about your thoughts on the Academy today?
So I think the thing I've given you a lot, right?
Yes.
Practice being in the conflict, which is good, and you will get calmer and you get better at it if you practice being in the conflict. But with most of my teaching and most of my sort of rhetorical engagement always goes back to Augustine's little treatise on catechizing. Which it's lovely. If you've not read that recently, it's worth looking at again on catechizing the uninstructed, right? Which he wrote for a deacon in Carthage who'd asked him, I'm getting really bored telling the same thing over and over again. How do you do it? And he does a lovely job saying, well, you have to adapt your address to the people that come to you for the catechizing, right? Because some of them are going to have one kind of background. They may be trained in the liberal arts. They may have been reading heretical works. They may know nothing, right? You have to figure out where your audience is coming from and go there with them first, right? Which is, that's why it is useful for Christians to at least learn the ways of the enemy.
Yes.
Because then you don't know what misconceptions people are laboring under, like with for example, the goddess stuff or something like that. And then, that you're always giving your instruction out of love, and with the recognition that, well, if you feel like you're not getting your ideas across, think what God feels like. and the incarnation was God's effort to come down into our situation and speak with us with our words, our language, to try to lift us up into understanding. So if Jesus could do it and stay patient with us, you can too. and then Augustine gives a sample history that he suggests Deo Gratias shows. It's like trying to show that what you're ultimately trying to say is like, we're in this same story, which is the Tolkien version of things, right? That we belong in this grand narrative. It's the story, it's our story, and we're part of it. And so, people are looking for a way in which they belong in the story. Well, this is the real story. This is the great story that we want to share with people and show what joy it is to be part of.
Yes. No, and remembering that, it reminds me of the part of the gospel where, finally the Lord, at the very end of his time on earth, the apostles say, so will you now restore the kingdom of Israel? And again, you just see, kind of like, how long, like, how many times do I have to tell you this? It's just, I think I always, when I get frustrated, I try to remember back to that. Well, if God himself could spend 3 years preparing these people to be the first apostles, and they didn't even get it, they just didn't get it, we have to be patient and have to not get frustrated by it. So, well.
Yes, think how patient he is with us.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, thank you for coming, introducing yourself to our viewers at Catholic Family News. I mentioned several of your books. You mentioned, and I'll just show it briefly, your non-academic, your blog site, the
Yes.
Fencing Bear at Prayer, which has lots of interesting commentary and different articles on it. So you can see that here if you want to take a look at that. It's very, very interesting. If you have enjoyed this program, as I always do, please ask you to share this content, this free content, send it to your friends, your acquaintances. You never know what will pique someone's interest. So I think maybe they won't like it, they can just delete it. So send it around. Please subscribe to our channel, particularly our Rumble channel. As I've said, we're getting into lots of trouble with YouTube. So at some point that may disappear. So please subscribe to our version on Rumble so that you don't miss any episodes in case something happens. And if you've enjoyed our free content, please consider subscribing to Catholic Family News monthly newspaper, which you can get either in electronic form or mailed to your home in traditional paper form. So thank you, Dr. Fulton Brown, for joining us and sharing some of your insights. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, thank you, and we'll see you next time. God bless you. Thank you.